Hi everyone, welcome to my Mediation and Beyond YouTube's channel. And today I'm so honored and probably a little bit of a guru and fan of Michaela Boehm. And she is a really a relationship expert is how I would describe Michaela. She travels internationally. She speaks on relationships and intimacy and helping us just to kind of understand them. In a way, I think that what I like about her style is it just breaks it down to simplicity where everybody can kind of understand how to really up-level our lives personally first, and then collectively in our relationships and anything beyond. So Michaela, you're out in California, so thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to, I've read so much about you, and I'll put more of your information in the details below for subscribers, for anybody who wants to learn more about you. But one of the things I like to hear from you about really is, can you speak to like what got you on this track of, you know, being a counselor in general and just on the track of relationships? How'd you navigate down that path?
Well, as these things happen, I didn't have, well planned out career goals. It wasn't one of those, right? I didn't sit down, chart it out, and go at it, because I think for me it was much more an organic uncovering and unfolding within my chosen profession, which was helping people and working with people. And so that's how it started. I wanted to contribute to people and work with people on their well-being and on, their relationships in a wider sense as well. And so when I started my counseling practice, which was in '96, believe it or not.
A few years ago.
Just a few years ago, right? It turned out that a lot of the things people came for, they said it was one thing, and then it always boiled down to either sex or relationship or both. Right? Yeah. And so then, of course, I went on this whole path of working with people in that particular domain, and I've done over 30,000 client hours in my lifetime so far. Wow. And so, which is a lot. I clocked an enormous amount of hours in the early years, particularly, because I kind of figured, well, I might as well get as much experience under my belt as possible. Yeah. And also, I came from Europe, so I had to kind of just start again, right. Meaning I was 28 or something around that time. So I had to kind of start again. So I was like, well, I might as well. So I did an enormous amount of hours. And in that time, it turned out that what was most effective and what was most useful was not what I thought, would be, or what I was taught, but a combination of getting people back into their body, pointing out or leading people towards areas where they had real closures and contractions and trauma. And when I'm saying trauma, I'm talking in the widest sense, any kind of injury of the emotional, physical, or mental kind. Mm-hmm. And that those kind of contractions of the body and the inability to feel fully was one aspect of the work that needed to be done. But then, because otherwise you can't be intimate with someone else, right? Unless you can be intimate with yourself, right? So there was that aspect. And then, of course, within that, I also realized very quickly that just talking wasn't going to do it, because it just doesn't, right? And so my work and my practice became very embodied in the sense that I realized that I had to devise exercises for people to actually try these things out in person and not just think about it, because you can't just think about it. You have to actually do it. And relationship and sex happens in the body, so can't be devoid of the body. So that whole thing happened at the same time. And then I had a very strong leaning and had worked within forensics. And so the thing that I really was fascinated by was what makes people behave the way they do, right? what patterning and what are the predictors, and so that was a really, really strong personal interest of mine, which turned out was really applicable to couples.
Right.
Because the same things that make people commit crimes, or other things that play out in a relationship, the
Absolutely.
dynamics. And so all of these things kind of combined together with a few other influences that were very pivotal in me developing the work I do nowadays. But it was really, really organic. One thing led to another, and there it went. And I think within about 5 years, I pretty much exclusively dealt with the realm of relationship, not necessarily only romantic relationship, but how people interact with each other, or the lack thereof, and what plays into that.
And so when you're talking about the trauma and holding that in our body, right, you go back to saying that's any kind of trauma, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm phrasing it in the broadest sense possible. That could be an actual physical injury or a surgical trauma. That could be emotional things from the very severe to the very mild. It doesn't really matter. Just because somebody else was worse off doesn't mean certain injuries of the emotional kind don't stick in our body, and with that our behavior. And then of course, things we think, things we get exposed to, societal stuff, epigenetics. I mean, all of that plays into how we, let's say, instead of saying trauma, we could say how we don't like to feel, or how we can't feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm talking about, pretty much.
And so with relationships and the trauma piece, I know when I was doing couples work, I would do a lot of legacy work, like, because I always say that where you are right now is all informed upon what your past has led you to. And so when you bring two people together, it is not just those two people you really bring together. You bring everything about them together. So in the work you're doing, is it helping each person in the partnership understanding not only themselves, but also what their partners are really bringing to the table?
In an ideal world, yes. Yeah. There's always the ideal world, and then there's how it plays out, right? I think my main goal is always to, and I think this is the other thing that I didn't say earlier, right? A big part of what ails relationship and why relationship goes bad is that people don't understand that those are skills. And somehow it is assumed we are born with this, or these are traits, or that we get it. But anything else a human being has to learn is learned by repetition and practice, and by getting an education. For some reason, it's assumed that the imprints we inherit from our family of origin, or the people who raise us, is enough to equip us in a relationship, and it isn't, right? So and you have to learn skills, and that could be as trite but important as actual sexual skills, and as subtle and sometimes not so obvious as, like you said, entangling or disentangling familial and legacy patterns, right? And so yeah, in an ideal world, when I work with two people, and sometimes I only work with one out of a couple for a while, that can also happen, or I see people separately, which is a whole other, fun endeavor. But I'm trying to do equal support, right? Understanding and non-judgmental, witnessing and being there with someone, right? As I do very, very practical education and skill development, and also education of the body, so somatic work, where the body gets, where you learn what triggers you, what happens when you get triggered, where's the trigger coming from,
Yeah.
how do you work against the trigger, what happens when you get triggered and you can't get out of the trigger, and do that for both people in a way that they can actually interact with each other, not on the autopilot or knee jerk of the trigger, but with enough distance so that something else can also occur.
And so that somebody else would actually have their partner would have a better understanding of how to handle when somebody is triggered, instead of them having their own separate knee-jerk reaction to it.
Correct.
Do you do individual, couples, and do you do group work as well?
I do these days, I do way more group work than I do anything else. Well, not at the moment,
Right.
of course.
Sans COVID, right? Before COVID.
Pre-COVID, I would spend 9 months out of the year traveling and teaching internationally, where I teach large groups, and I've designed all kinds of exercises that allow people to learn experientially. And I've developed an entire somatic release method called the nonlinear movement method, which works on unraveling bodily contractions and in a very non-force, non-impositional way. So I spend a lot more time nowadays in large group teaching than in one-on-one sessions.
Do you think that if you have a trauma, and I think everybody has some kind of trauma, right?
Yeah, if we define it as an injury of the physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, societal kind, yes, we all have things happened in the context of us growing up, or in the context of us becoming relational beings.
And if so, then what you're saying is really you can't, well, not you can't, but it is better to, if you want a quality, healthy relationship, you really have to focus on shifting, understanding, working with that trauma, instead of just acknowledging that it's there and then try to say, okay, let's have a good relationship. Oh, I was traumatized. Let's have a good relationship. So you really have to work it through in order to bring yourself to that next level, right?
Well, the have is always a caveat, because not everybody does it and not everybody has to do it, right? But we can assume that the injuries of our past have created behavior patterns, right? As they would have created physical patterns. If I break my leg and the leg doesn't heal properly because I had to, I don't know, travel or something, didn't take care of it properly, or didn't have enough physical therapy, I might have a limp for the rest of my life. Now, does that mean I can't walk or run? No, but I will have a noticeable limp. And that is a little bit how it sometimes happens, right? If you're getting into a relationship with somebody who had a really, really horrible divorce, it doesn't matter how lovey-dovey and wonderful and you are the one and this is totally different than my last marriage is, you have a limp. Or more, right? You might have a few black eyes and an empty bank account and are estranged from your children, and some, right? And that has to be addressed. If it's just a limp and all the healing has been done, well, there's maybe not that much to be addressed. But if you're still actively needing physical therapy, you're going to have to address that, so to speak, in relationship. And so I think best practice for long-term success of a relationship, if that's what you choose, is that there is understanding that a lot of the things that happen in the relationship is a dynamic built on previous behavior patterns or previous, let's say, trauma patterns. Right. And that we actually, as a matter of fact, are attracting people who bring out the worst and the best in us.
Amen. People, I hear that all the time. Like, how did I pick that person? It's the same person I just left. But if you don't do the work, then the chances are you're going to keep picking that same kind of person.
It's the same way that when you're used to your toilet paper being one way on the dispenser, that's how you reach. If it gets turned around, you get all disturbed by it, right? Because you don't have a habit pattern around it, and that's definitely true in relationship on a much grander scale. Right?
Yeah, that's actually, I never thought I'd be comparing toilet paper rollers to relationships, but I love the analogy. I think it's great. So during COVID, you know, I think a lot of good things have come out of COVID, you know, in terms of like taking time to pause and self-reflect. And but when you're in a relationship, what I'm hearing and seeing is a little bit of the opposite there, where couples are like too much time and not enough space and distance. What are some things that people can do to kind of help themselves get through this, so that they're not ending up in my office doing like a divorce mediation, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the first and foremost thing to say is that, of course, any kind of real stress situation brings out what I call the fault lines,
Oh,
right? So I always liken it to, you know, nice piece of paper,
yep.
right? Now it's crumbled. Now I can, of course, unfold this thing and I can smooth it out. And if I'm really nifty and I have an iron, I can iron it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I can get it completely flat. But the moment I put pressure on it, it will crease in exactly the same fault lines, the same creases as it did before, right?
Right.
And so these creases here,
Yep.
these are your behavior patterns. So meaning it doesn't matter how much work you've done, as a matter of fact, or how enlightened you are, or how well-meaning you are. When there's a lot of stress on the paper, so to speak, it will start creasing. And COVID, certainly for a lot of people, has been very stressful for a number of reasons, right? I mean, let's not even talk lack of income and things like that. Let's just talk about homeschooling kids,
Yes.
right? And even if you don't have children, working from home with a partner working from home, and just having to figure out Zoom and the strain of being on Zoom all day, every day, and blah, blah, blah. And then if you don't live like I do in the countryside where you can go for walks, but you're in New York City or somewhere, right, where you can't even leave the apartment, or
Yeah,
London.
New York, it's really tough to be able to get out and just kind of take a walk, and
Right.
you're not really where you're walking to.
Yeah, and anytime you meet somebody on the street, particularly in the beginning, right, where we didn't know that much yet, it was just like somebody walks by you, you were convinced you were a dead woman walking, essentially, right? It was really, really, really scary. So yes, of course, that will bring up the fault lines. So anything that has ever been an issue in the relationship will bubble up.
Okay.
Also, anything that has nothing to do with the relationship and that has just to do with how people cope with stress. This could be maladaptive eating, or drinking, or drugs, or anger problems, or nitpicking, or having to be a control freak and keep everything neat so you feel a sense of safety. All of those things will pop up. So the mark of a really good relationship is that it actually strengthens in time of extreme stress.
Okay.
That's usually what people who have really good relationships report. There might be strain, but people start going, okay, well, we need to pull on the same side of this rope, right? We're going to get this done. And then the little stuff and the escalated and elevated stuff gets kind of disregarded. But if that's not the case, if there were fault lines already, now you're in real trouble, right? And it's not good under any circumstances. And then if you can't get away from each other, then it gets real. Then it's like a pressure cooker. And of course, the other thing that we haven't even talked about yet is that a lot of people reference themselves and have an identity based on what they do out in the world.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And then that's taken. And now you're just a dude in his pajamas in front of a TV screen or a computer screen. And you're just a woman in her joggers in the next room in front of a computer screen.
Yep.
And there's nothing else to talk about other than the bad news and the logistics and the horror of being locked up at home in front of a computer screen. And that will put a toll even on the best relationship. So what do you do?
Yeah. Yes. What do you do?
Yeah, what do you do? Well, here are some of the things that I found useful for the people I work with. Like I said, these are generalizations, and of course, not taking into account people's activity levels, health levels, their children, if they have children, the state of their relationship, whatever, right? So this is a broad strokes.
Yep.
So one of the things, and I think this is one of the most important things that people will have to do, is to renegotiate the terms of the relationship.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is there has to be an acknowledgement where people sit down and go, this is not normal. This isn't normal, and we cannot apply our normal ways of being around this. This is very, very hard for people because our make-believe world is centered around things going back to normal.
Right.
Right? And so to actually go, this is far from normal and we don't know when normal is happening, is not that easy. But the next step then is to go, okay, so what do we need to do, the two of us, so we can make it through it? And then that poses a series of questions. How are we going to arrange X, Y, and Z, right? Who does what? What's different now from how it used to be? Do we need to adjust our roles? How do our expectations need to be adjusted? That's a very important one, right? You're not going to be swinging off the rafters, having hot sex every night when there's a pandemic and you see each other in your pajamas in front of your computer all day. You're just not.
No.
Right? So it's like, let's just get with it and then go, what can we do?
Yeah, so acknowledging is huge.
Yeah, yeah. And then the next thing is, what can we do? What do we need to renegotiate? Suddenly the rules have changed. Maybe suddenly the person who was the primary child rearing partner, right, is the one who still has work and needs to work more because the one who used to leave the house and make the money is laid off, or things like that, right? So it's a proper renegotiation of circumstances. And when you renegotiate the circumstances, you're suddenly in a different boat. And then it's easier to not have the same expectations because you're not actually in that set of circumstances. And you are out of your habit patterns. So it's actually a lot better, even though it might be tough, because you're not running a program that hasn't been updated yet, and that slows down the entire system, right? So that's one big thing. And then on the practical level, it is absolutely crucial that each person in the relationship gets time away and quiet time.
Okay.
That's super important. Even if this just means somebody pours themselves a bath, closes the bathroom door, and doesn't come out for an hour and a half with a glass of wine and some favorite music, right, and a book.
Yeah.
Or
self-care kind of stuff, whatever you need. Right.
Or the other person doesn't want to have a long conversation, but wants to just sit in front of the TV, watch a show by themselves while eating potato chips and whatever, right? So that has to be okay, and it has to be agreed upon. And it can't be negotiated as in, well, but today I really need to talk with you. Yes, but later, right?
Yeah.
So that's super, super important.
Kind of like sacred space, sacred time to
alone,
rejuvenate.
right?
Yeah, alone to rejuvenate.
And then also sacred space together. And that one has a very, very strong rule. And that rule is you can't talk about any of the stuff that you usually talk throughout the day.
Yeah.
Right. Now that leaves a lot of people in a massive lurch.
That is so true.
They sit there and they're like, I give this as an assignment to people sometimes, and they come back and they go, we sat there for an hour, we had nothing to say, we have no interests outside of the kids, the dog, politics, what we're going to eat, and the job. And it's like, well, why don't you get some interest? Right?
Yeah.
And that is it's a rude awakening for any couple. And by the way, this is not just COVID specific. This happens almost in any relationship, that people run out of things to talk with each other, and that is a slow and painful death in a certain way. And the way you remedy that is you get some interests, right? If it's just reading some other books than what you usually read, or getting interested in something that's new and that you can report on, or starting a new workout routine or a new hobby or a new crafts or whatever. So there has to be some sense of newness in the relationship for the relationship to still be interesting.
Right. Yeah, that's why date nights or things like that are so important, but not to be talking about all the things that add the weight to our lives. And we need to become more interesting to each other.
Yes, most definitely we need to become more interesting to each other, right? And then the last thing is, the last thing is a twofold thing. I'll give the practical thing first. There's many more, but these are the important ones. Is to come up with activities that can be done together within the lockdown or the situation, that are new and mutually enjoyable. And I've heard some really interesting stuff, from where people came up with some really, really interesting stuff. So one couple I know have started like a little podcast where she cooks and he asks questions, and she shows how she makes food, and then they'll eat it together and they'll talk about it, and they do the food of all the places they traveled.
Love it.
So they go, oh, when we went to Indonesia, what did we like? What kind of a food? Then they research it, then they cook it, and they have the little photos of when they went. They give a little travel report, and they do that for themselves. And of course, they do something with it. So I've seen that. I've had another couple I know back in Austria where my parents live. They started had puzzles made from some of their family photos. And then the whole family would assemble this massive puzzle.
Love it.
And then they talk about whatever was on the photo and stuff like that. So, there's interesting things you can do, or reading to each other, or whatever, right? Showing the other person their favorite YouTube clips or whatever. whatever works, right?
But to have fun, and that's the thing. It's just to be fun. You're not sitting around doing the puzzle talking about the problems. You're sitting,
exactly,
right? You're sitting enjoying the moments with each other. It's like that's the key to it. It's like to be fun again.
Yeah, and a bit stimulation.
Which isn't always easy. And I love, because some of the things you're talking about, I mean, this doesn't cost money. Like, this isn't, right? I mean, these are things you can kind of do on a really small budget, if any budget, and just get back to liking each other. You liked each other before you had children, for the most part. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're together for a reason. And I think people lose that. What's the reason we got together? Although you grow and change over time, but there's that core element of you liked each other.
That's right.
I've heard a lot of that getting lost, the liking each other.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the other thing, right? Because what do they say? Familiarity breeds contempt.
Oh, yes, that is very true.
Yeah.
So therefore, become a little more exciting, do things a little different, become more interesting to each other. Well, those are some really good things, I think that base foundational piece, kind of acknowledging that this isn't working, and then being proactive about coming up with ideas to become more of a partnership, more interesting to each other than you're not your problems, right?
Yeah. Well, and I want to say that the acknowledgement isn't just this isn't working. The acknowledgement is we are in a different boat now. Right. It might be working, but it's just not, it's not the same. And to actually, so to speak, renegotiate the terms of the contract, is very, very important. This is, by the way, also important in non-COVID times on a regular basis. And that would actually prevent a lot of divorce, I think, is if people would be asked every couple of years to define the purpose of their relationship. And
when you said like renegotiate, and when you said that at first, I was like, I don't think most people think about that they even have any, I mean, other than a marital contract, but that they have this kind of unspoken contract with each other. I think a lot of things are so unspoken, and then you have these inherent expectations that don't get met, and then we think somebody is the way they are, and they're really not, or maybe they were and they've changed.
Yeah. Well, yes, and that's the thing, right? I always say this to my younger clients. It's like, well, you want a guy to, to be a digital nomad with and travel the world and have adventure, right? So you find that guy, that's a specific kind of a guy, and your relationship is based on traveling around the world, having adventures and whatever, recording it on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, one of you goes, well, I want to have a baby. Well, suddenly, you're in a totally different set of circumstances.
Yes.
You don't travel with an infant, not as readily and certainly not as adventurously. Now, I mean, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, right, you might want to nest a bit. You might want to be a little bit more stable with your income and not have to go waitress in Bangkok to make it to Cambodia,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Yes.
that it's a different life. So then what happens is, unless both people are aligned in those goals, there'll be a huge rift, because one person will go, no, but I signed up for adventure. And the other person goes, yeah, I'm done with adventure. I now want the next thing. Well, then let's talk about what's the next thing. And then if nobody gets on board, or you're not on board on the same thing, well, then hopefully you don't have a child in that particular moment. One can hope.
Right.
So and maybe you don't continue together, versus nothing gets discussed, and then 5 years later somebody leaves with huge resentment, and now there's so much more at stake. And so that I think is a really important thing, is that what is the purpose of the relationship? Are you really on the same page? Because if you get into a relationship for, let's say, self-development, which some people in California do, if you get into a relationship for self-development, you're essentially commodifying your partner for your own growth, so to speak, right? Yeah. That's a very different relationship than when you get into a relationship to have a family, where you're essentially sacrificing some of your personal needs for the sake of your children. Or if you just want to have a great time and sexual adventures and be free and careless, not careless in a bad way, carefree, I should say.
Yeah.
That's a totally different set of circumstances. So then people are surprised that the people who signed up for the transactional relationship that is required for, let's say, have a business together and move big things in the world, and then they'll go, but I want the romance. Well, didn't exactly go for the romance to begin with. Why do you expect now, or the other way around, right?
Well, and then people get upset when the other person doesn't change when you're ready to change. So if you're the one who's ready to have children and family, that doesn't mean your partner's on board, and that's the space they're in. So
right.
But it's about navigating those conversations, and I think the essence of it is having conversations, right? Having them, and I think many people don't.
Yeah, I think many people don't, but I think also many people don't know that they can, right? Because there's so much emotional stuff wrapped up. This brings us back to previous patterning, right? The unwillingness to actually speak directly, because it could mean loss of love, or not having boundaries, or having such strict boundaries that you can see beyond the procedure or whatever, right? And so often it doesn't occur to people that they could just sit down, and if they can do it by themselves with somebody, and go, okay, let's have a conversation.
Well, it's all that modeling that you started at earlier in the conversation, right? People don't have the skill sets, and they don't have a lot of times the modeling from their history to know to know how to do that. So
That's what there's professionals for.
Absolutely. That's what there's your retreats for, and connecting with you. So your retreats are on hold during COVID, I suspect.
I'm teaching online, so I'm still doing quite a bit of stuff, the somatic stuff particularly. I'm training teachers in the somatic modality and in some women's things. I have a women's group, a 12-month women's group that can be done online. So I'm doing as much as I can online.
That's great.
I just did a couples retreat online, which works for a certain amount of time, right? Meaning nobody should spend more than 4 or 5 hours a day in front of a computer with a partner or without, right? So in-person things can be, of course, much more detailed. And when you are in a retreat, then there's no kids running in or dogs needing to be walked. That's the problem from teaching and working from home, is that it all melds together into this weird conglomerate of stuff.
Yeah, how people run into their cars to make a phone call, right?
Exactly.
Kind of
and taking all of that into account, I'm still teaching, and I actually developed this little thing called the Intimacy Toolkit, which is just 5-minute exercises that people can do when they're really rushed.
And is that on your website?
Yeah, it's all on the website.
Okay. Well,
everything you could ever want to know or not is on the website.
Okay. All right. Well, I will put your details in the subscription in the details below. And I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to talk with you. Like, you have so many helpful, kind of just smart, easy, not easy, but easy ideas for people to at least start with, right? And I think that's sometimes people just need that place to start when they don't know where to start.
Yes. And a lot of times people come to the work I do and say something like, well, that's so simple. And the answer is yes, right? Because the thing that trips up the progress is the complication or the aspiration, right? You can't have an aspirational relationship. Just because somebody tells you should be hanging off the rafters at all times, it doesn't mean, if you haven't even touched each other because you're so disgusted with each other, that's not where you start. You start out by actually looking into each other's eyes for a few seconds, instead of mumbling to each other on the way to the bathroom, right? And then you unfold it from there. And so the key is, one of the most useful things I have ever been taught was my first teacher said, the best practice is the practice you do. Right. And that's really, really important, right? The best practice is the practice you do. Meaning, even if you can only do 3 minutes with your partner once a day, if you do that, that's a lot better than all of the fancy stuff that you could get that you're never going to do.
Right, and you don't need to go from A to Z. Like, there's A, we can go the next, and so we don't have to, it's that immediate gratification. Like, it doesn't always, there's not always a payoff, right? Yeah. People get frustrated with that. But I love that. Just do you and do something. I always say do something rather than do nothing, right? So thank you, Michaela. I really appreciate your time. I can see that you got a lot going on, which is really good. And I'll put the details below. Anyone who watches this, they can reach out to you through your contact information that I'll give, correct?
Correct, yes.
And for the certifications, do people have to be prior therapists, or do they have to have any? No. Okay, good to know.
The freestanding modalities that a lot of people use them in conjunction with, for instance, being a therapist or trauma therapist or a coach. But a lot of people just do it freestanding because it is so non-impositional. You can just, you learn how to facilitate really well, and everything else the body does by itself, right? So there's safeguards to make sure that people can't fuck other people up, to say it very bluntly.
Yeah, no, that's the best way to say it. That's what I like. Simplicity is what it is, but it's, so just, kind of could a couple become certified? Like, would that be certified together? Like,
Yeah, I mean, there's different programs, right?
okay.
So the women's teacher training is just to facilitate women's groups.
Sure.
So that's not really a couples
Right.
endeavor necessarily, but the embodiment teacher training, which teaches the nonlinear movement method, there is a few couples who actually teach together already, and it's open to anyone who is interested in facilitating somatic healing and somatic movement. And then, other things can be done as couples, and some things I designate as couples practices. I just did where you had to have somebody else in the room with you,
Right.
of course.
Yes.
But most things are open to just anyone.
Anybody. All right. Well, that's good to know. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I love following you, and I will continue to follow you and learn about the work you're doing. And thank you again. Stay safe and stay healthy.
The same to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michaela. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.